He wasn't supposed to survive the night, not out there where the wind cut through bone and memory alike, where even silence felt frozen in place beneath a sky too cold to care, and yet somewhere between the drifting snow and the dim flicker of a dying porch light, something kept breathing when it should have stopped. The road outside Evelyn Pierce's house stretched empty for nearly half a mile in either direction, a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt dusted in white, the kind of road people only used if they had nowhere else to go. And on that night, the temperature had dropped to just above 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that didn't just chill the air, but settled deep into the marrow, turning every breath into something sharp and visible. Inside the small, weathered house at the edge of the tree line, Evelyn sat alone in her worn armchair, a thin blanket folded over her lap, her hands wrapped around a mug that had long since gone cold, the quiet hum of an old space heater filling the room like a fragile heartbeat. She hadn't turned on the television in weeks. The silence suited her now. It had been 5 years since the last voice had echoed through these walls. 5 years since her son Daniel had left for his final deployment and never returned. And though the world outside kept moving, Evelyn had learned how to remain still within it, as if any sudden motion might shatter what little peace she had managed to gather from the ruins of memory. The wind pressed softly against the windows, a low, hollow sound, almost like a distant call, and for a moment she thought she imagined it, the faintest interruption in the rhythm of the night, something just beyond the edge of hearing. But then it came again, sharper this time, a thin, broken sound that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. Evelyn set the mug down slowly, her fingers stiff, her breath catching not from fear but from recognition, because grief teaches you the difference between silence and something asking not to be left behind. She rose carefully, her joints protesting with quiet resistance, and moved toward the front door, each step measured, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her weight. When she opened the door, the cold rushed in immediately, biting and sudden, wrapping around her like a warning, but she didn't step back. She leaned forward instead, peering into the dim wash of moonlight that barely reached the edge of her porch, and that was when she saw them. Two shapes, low to the ground, half buried in drifting snow, pressed close together as if sharing what little warmth remained between them. For a moment, they didn't move at all, and she thought she might already be too late. But then one of them lifted its head, slowly, with a kind of effort that seemed almost impossible, and two amber eyes met hers, not wild, not afraid, but steady in a way that felt deeply human, as if they understood exactly what it meant to be seen in the moment before everything gave out. The other dog remained still, its breathing shallow, barely visible against the pale air, and Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest, not panic, not hesitation, but a quiet certainty she hadn't felt in years. She stepped off the porch without thinking, the snow crunching beneath her boots, the cold immediately biting through the thin fabric of her coat. But she kept moving, closing the distance between them, lowering herself slowly to her knees despite the stiffness in her bones. "It's all right," she whispered, though her voice was almost lost to the wind. "You're not alone." The stronger dog didn't retreat. It didn't bark or growl. It simply watched her, its body trembling, its breath uneven, as if weighing something far deeper than fear. And when Evelyn reached out, her hand hovering just inches from its fur, it leaned forward, just enough, a small, fragile motion that carried more trust than any words ever could. She moved quickly after that, though nothing about her movements felt rushed, lifting the smaller one first, surprised by how light it was, how little strength remained in its body, then guiding the other gently toward the porch, her hands steady despite the cold that had begun to creep into her fingers. Inside, the warmth of the house felt almost unreal, a thin barrier against the night that had nearly taken them, and as she closed the door behind her, the wind cut off instantly, leaving only the sound of their breathing, uneven, fragile, but still there. Evelyn didn't speak again. She didn't need to, because in that quiet room, beneath the dim glow of a single lamp, something had already begun to change, something small and unseen, like the first crack of light before dawn, the kind that doesn't announce itself but waits patiently to be noticed. And for the first time in a long while, the silence inside her home didn't feel empty anymore. The smaller one barely made a sound when she set him down near the heater, just a faint exhale that trembled through his body like a thread about to snap, while the other remained standing for a moment longer, legs unsteady, eyes moving slowly across the room as if memorizing every shadow, every corner, every possible way in and out, until at last he lowered himself beside the first, not out of weakness but out of choice, placing his body close enough to shield what little warmth remained. Between them, Evelyn moved with a quiet urgency that came not from panic but from instinct, the kind that had been buried under years of stillness yet never truly left her, pulling an old wool blanket from the back of the couch and laying it gently over them, her hands lingering just long enough to feel the fragile rise and fall of their breathing. The air inside the house carried the faint scent of dust and cedar, warmed now by the steady hum of the heater, and for a moment she simply knelt there, watching, listening, as if the rhythm of their survival had become something she needed to learn by heart. She rose slowly and crossed into the kitchen, filling a shallow bowl with lukewarm water, careful not to let it run too cold or too hot, then returning to their side and placing it within reach, though neither dog moved toward it at first. The stronger one kept his head lifted, eyes following her every motion, not with suspicion but with a kind of guarded awareness, as though he had been trained not just to observe but to remember. When she reached out again, this time to gently wipe away the thin layer of ice clinging to the smaller one's fur, her fingers brushed against something beneath the damp coat, something firm and unfamiliar, and she paused. Carefully, she parted the fur along the neck and found it there, a collar, dark and worn, its edges frayed as if it had been through more than weather alone, and attached to it, a small metal tag dulled by time. She turned it slightly toward the light, squinting as the letters caught just enough glow to be read, though not clearly, not completely, as if part of the name had been deliberately scratched away. The stronger dog let out a low breath, not a growl, not a warning, just a sound that seemed to carry weight, and for a second Evelyn felt it settle into the room like a question that had no easy answer. "Where did you come from?" she murmured, more to the silence than to them. But the dog's ears shifted at the sound of her voice, subtle, controlled, attentive. She set the tag back gently and continued to dry the smaller one, working slowly, methodically, until at last there was a flicker of response, a slight movement of the paw, a shallow attempt at lifting the head that did not quite succeed, but was enough to change something in the air. "That is it," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost a breath. "Stay with me." The stronger dog finally lowered his head, though his eyes never closed, and after a moment, he leaned just slightly toward the bowl, taking a careful sip before pulling back, as if testing whether the safety around him was real or something that might vanish the moment he trusted it. Time moved differently after that, not in minutes or hours, but in breaths, in the slow return of warmth to limbs that had nearly forgotten it, and Evelyn found herself sitting on the floor beside them, her back resting against the couch, her hand lightly placed on the blanket as if anchoring them there. Outside, the wind continued its steady passage through the trees, but it felt farther away now, less like a threat and more like a memory. At some point, the smaller dog's breathing deepened, not strong, not yet, but steadier, and the room seemed to exhale with him. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, not to sleep but to listen, to the quiet, to the presence of something that had not been there before, something that filled the empty spaces without asking permission. When she opened them again, she noticed the stronger dog watching her still, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time, she saw something beyond caution there, something quieter, almost like recognition, as though in the dim light of that small room, two lives that had no reason to cross paths had somehow found each other at exactly the moment they were meant to, and neither of them intended to let go. The night did not end all at once. It softened, slowly, like frost loosening its grip on the edges of a window, and sometime past what must have been 2 in the morning, Evelyn felt it before she saw it, a shift in the room so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. But it was there, carried in the breath of the smaller dog as it deepened just enough to sound less like a struggle and more like a quiet insistence on staying. She leaned forward slightly, her hand still resting on the blanket, and watched as his chest rose a fraction higher than before, uneven but determined, like someone relearning how to hold on. "That is right," she whispered again, not expecting a response, only offering presence, the kind that asks nothing in return. The stronger dog remained awake, though his posture had changed, his body no longer coiled with tension, but stretched just enough to suggest a guarded rest. His head now lowered closer to the floor, though his eyes continued to follow every small movement Evelyn made. There was something deliberate in the way he watched, something practiced, as if vigilance had once been his purpose and he did not yet know how to set it aside. Evelyn shifted carefully, easing herself up from the floor with a quiet exhale, and moved toward the kitchen once more, this time opening an old cabinet that had not been touched in weeks. Inside, tucked behind a stack of unused plates, was a small tin container, the kind that held simple things, dry crackers, bits of leftover bread, things she had stopped buying much of lately. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the lid, as if measuring what it meant to begin again, even in something as small as this. Then she opened it and took out what little she had, breaking it into smaller pieces before returning to the living room. The heater clicked softly as it adjusted, a low hum filling the space, and she knelt again, placing the food near the bowl of water. This time, the stronger dog moved first, slow and careful, his nose brushing the pieces as if confirming they were real, then taking one gently between his teeth, chewing with a restraint that spoke of both hunger and discipline. He did not rush. He did not take more than he needed. And after a moment, he nudged one piece closer to the smaller dog, a gesture so quiet it might have gone unnoticed if not for the way Evelyn's breath caught just slightly at the sight. "You are watching over him," she murmured, her voice barely more than a thought, and something in her chest tightened, not with pain but with recognition, because she had seen that kind of loyalty before, years ago, in letters written from faraway places, in stories her son used to tell about the men beside him, about how no one was ever truly left behind. The smaller dog stirred again, this time managing to lift his head just enough to catch the scent, his nose twitching weakly before he took a small bite, clumsy but certain, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath with him. Outside, the wind had quieted, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if the world itself had stepped back to allow this fragile moment to unfold without interruption. Evelyn remained where she was, her movements slow, deliberate, unwilling to disturb the delicate balance that had begun to form. She reached once more toward the collar, her fingers brushing the metal tag again, and this time she brought it closer to the light, angling it carefully until the faint engraving revealed just a little more than before. There were numbers beneath the worn letters, partially visible, arranged in a way that did not belong to something random, something that hinted at structure, at belonging, at a place these dogs had once known that was far from the edge of her quiet road. She did not understand it fully, not yet, but she felt it settle into her thoughts like a distant echo, something that would matter come morning. The stronger dog watched her as she examined it, his gaze steady, not resisting, not pulling away, but waiting, as if he understood that whatever truth was tied to that small piece of metal was already beginning to find its way back into the light. Evelyn set it down gently and drew the blanket closer around them, her hand lingering just long enough to offer warmth where it was still needed. She leaned back against the couch once more, her eyes growing heavy, not from exhaustion alone, but from a quiet release she had not allowed herself in years. And as the first faint hint of dawn began to press against the edges of the dark sky beyond her window, she let herself close them, trusting, for the first time in a long while, that something in this world was still capable of finding its way back from the cold. Morning did not arrive with sound but with light, thin and pale, slipping through the edges of the curtains like something cautious, something unsure if it was welcome, and as it stretched across the worn wooden floor, it found Evelyn already awake. Though she had not truly slept, only rested in that quiet space between memory and presence where time seemed to pause just long enough for something new to take root. The room carried a different weight now, not lighter exactly, but fuller, as if the silence had been given shape, and when she looked down, she saw them still there, still breathing, still holding on. The smaller one lay curled beneath the blanket, his chest rising in slow, uneven rhythms that no longer felt like they were fading, while the stronger dog remained alert even in rest, his head lifting the moment he sensed her movement, ears tilting forward, eyes steady and aware. For a second, neither of them moved beyond that simple acknowledgement, and in that stillness, something passed between them that did not need words, something built not from trust yet, but from the beginning of it. Evelyn shifted carefully, her joints stiff from the cold that had lingered in her bones, and reached for the kettle in the kitchen, filling it with water and setting it on the stove, the faint click of the burner breaking the quiet in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. It had been a long time since she had prepared anything for more than herself, and even now, the act carried a kind of hesitation, as though she was stepping into a role she had set aside years ago. The smell of warming metal and steam began to rise slowly, mixing with the faint scent of wool and cedar that filled the house. And behind her, she heard it, the soft scrape of movement, the stronger dog rising to his feet, not fully relaxed but no longer on the edge of retreat. He took a few careful steps toward the kitchen, stopping just at the threshold, his body angled in a way that kept both Evelyn and the smaller dog within his line of sight, as if he had already assigned himself a position in a place he did not yet understand. "You do not have to stand guard anymore," Evelyn said quietly, though her voice held no command, only observation, and the dog's ears flicked slightly at the sound, though he did not move away. She poured a small amount of warmed water into a bowl and carried it back, setting it beside the blanket. And this time, the smaller dog responded more quickly, lifting his head with effort but without the same strain as before, his tongue brushing the surface in small, careful laps. It was not much, but it was enough to mark a shift, enough to tell her that whatever had brought them to the edge the night before had not taken them beyond it. Evelyn sat down beside them again, her hand resting lightly on the blanket, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply watch, to let the quiet unfold without needing to fill it. Outside, the world had begun to move again, though faintly, the distant hum of a passing truck somewhere beyond the trees, the soft crack of ice shifting along the roadside, the kind of sounds that reminded her that life continued whether one chose to follow it or not. But then something else reached her, something closer, the faint crunch of tires slowing on gravel, deliberate, controlled, and not part of the usual rhythm of this quiet stretch of road. The stronger dog heard it at the same time, his head lifting sharply, body tightening just enough to signal attention. Not panic, his gaze turning toward the front window as if drawn by something familiar. Evelyn followed his line of sight, her brow furrowing slightly, not yet alarmed but aware, and she rose slowly, moving toward the window with measured steps. The light outside had strengthened just enough to reveal shapes more clearly, and as she parted the curtain with careful fingers, she saw it. A vehicle at the edge of her property, dark against the pale morning, its engine idling low, its presence too deliberate to be accidental. It did not approach immediately. It did not turn away. It simply remained there, as if waiting, as if confirming something before deciding what came next. Evelyn felt a quiet tension settle into her chest. Not fear exactly, but the recognition that whatever story had brought these dogs to her door had not ended with the night. And behind her, the stronger dog took one slow step forward, placing himself between her and the door, not aggressively, not defensively, but with a quiet certainty that said he understood more than she did about what might be coming. And in that moment, as the morning light continued to spread across the room, Evelyn realized that the stillness she had grown used to was no longer empty. It was waiting. The vehicle did not move for several seconds, long enough for the engine's low hum to settle into the quiet of the morning like a question that refused to be answered, and Evelyn remained still by the window, her fingers resting lightly against the curtain as she watched, not with fear, but with the kind of attention that comes when something unknown begins to take shape just beyond understanding. Behind her, the stronger dog stood firm, his posture calm yet unmistakably alert, his body angled slightly forward as though he recognized something in the pattern of that stillness, something familiar in the way the vehicle waited instead of approaching. The smaller dog shifted under the blanket, a faint movement that drew Evelyn's attention for only a moment before her gaze returned outside, where the driver's door finally opened with slow deliberation. A man stepped out, tall, steady, dressed not in uniform, but in something close enough to carry the same presence. Dark jacket, straight posture, movements measured and controlled, as if every step had already been considered before it was taken. He did not rush toward the house. He did not call out. Instead, he paused beside the vehicle, scanning the property with a quiet focus that felt less like intrusion and more like confirmation. Evelyn felt something tighten gently in her chest. Not alarm, but recognition of purpose, the kind that does not arrive by accident. She stepped away from the window then, moving toward the door, her hand resting briefly on the edge of the table where the small metal tag still lay, catching a faint glint of morning light. For a second, she hesitated, her fingers brushing against it as if considering whether to take it with her, but something told her it was not needed, not yet, and she left it where it was. The stronger dog moved as she did, stepping ahead of her by just half a pace, not blocking her path, but guiding it, positioning himself near the door with a quiet certainty that spoke of training, of instinct shaped by something more than survival. "It is all right," Evelyn said softly, though she was not sure if she meant it for him or for herself, and she reached for the handle, turning it slowly. The cold air met her again as the door opened, though it no longer felt as sharp as it had the night before, and she stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking faintly beneath her weight. The man by the vehicle noticed her immediately, his posture straightening just slightly, and for a brief moment, they simply looked at one another across the short stretch of yard, two strangers connected by something neither had yet spoken aloud. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice steady, respectful, carrying just enough authority to suggest he was accustomed to being heard. "My name is Caleb Ward." He paused then, as if choosing his next words carefully, his gaze flicking briefly toward the house behind her, then back again. "We received a report early this morning," he continued, "about 2 dogs that may have come through this area overnight." Evelyn did not respond immediately. She let the words settle, let the meaning behind them take shape in her mind, and behind her, she felt the presence of the stronger dog just inside the doorway, unmoving but fully aware, his attention fixed not on the man's voice, but on something deeper within it. "They are here," Evelyn said at last, her voice calm, unhurried, though something within it carried weight, not resistance, not surrender, but a quiet truth. Caleb Ward nodded once, not surprised, not relieved, simply acknowledging what he had already suspected. "Are they safe?" he asked, and there was something in the way he said it, something that shifted the question from routine to personal, as if the answer mattered in a way that extended beyond procedure. Evelyn glanced back over her shoulder for just a moment, her eyes finding the shape beneath the blanket, the slow rise and fall of breath that had nearly been lost to the cold, then returned her gaze to the man. "They are alive," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried everything that had happened between the night and the morning. Caleb's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough to soften the edges of his composure, and he took a single step forward before stopping again, as if aware that whatever came next required more than authority, it required understanding. The air between them held still, charged not with conflict, but with the quiet tension of something about to be revealed, and inside the house, the stronger dog shifted his weight slightly, his presence steady, waiting, as though he understood that this moment, like the one before it, would decide more than just what happened next. It would decide who could be trusted to stay. Caleb did not step any closer after that, not because he could not, but because something in the way she stood there, steady and unafraid, told him that distance was not the problem, understanding was, and he had learned long ago that the wrong step at the wrong moment could close a door that trust had only just begun to open. The cold air drifted between them, softer now under the morning light, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, as if both were waiting for something unspoken to settle into place. Behind Evelyn, the stronger dog shifted slightly, just enough for Caleb to catch a glimpse of him through the open doorway, and the change in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of recognition, not just of the animal, but of what it represented. "May I?" Caleb asked quietly, lifting one hand in a small, measured gesture toward the house, his voice lowering not out of caution, but out of respect. Evelyn studied him for a moment, her eyes searching not for authority but for intention, and whatever she found there was enough, because she stepped aside without another word, allowing the space between them to close. Caleb moved forward then, slow, deliberate, his boots pressing lightly against the porch before crossing the threshold into the warmth of the house. And the moment he did, The atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, but enough for it to be felt. The stronger dog stood immediately, his body straightening, his gaze locking onto Caleb with an intensity that was neither hostile nor welcoming, but precise, as if measuring something beyond appearance. Caleb stopped just inside the doorway, not advancing further, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes meeting the dog's in a way that carried familiarity, not dominance. "Easy," he said softly, not as a command, but as recognition, and for a second, the room held still around that single word. The dog's ears flicked, his stance holding for just a moment longer before easing, not fully, but enough to signal that he had understood something in Caleb's presence. Evelyn watched the exchange in silence, her hands resting loosely at her sides, aware that whatever connection had just passed between them did not belong to her, but she could feel its weight nonetheless. Caleb's gaze moved then, taking in the room, the blanket, the smaller dog lying beneath it, and he stepped forward one careful pace, lowering himself slightly as he observed without touching. "He is weak," he said quietly, though it was not a question, and Evelyn nodded once. "He nearly did not make it through the night," she replied, her voice steady, and Caleb exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had been holding since before he arrived. He reached into his jacket then, pulling out a small device, not hurried, not concealed, and pressed a button briefly before speaking into it, his tone calm, controlled. "I have them," he said, pausing for a second as if listening, then continuing, "both alive." The device responded with a faint crackle, too soft for Evelyn to make out the words, but whatever was said caused Caleb's expression to tighten just slightly, not with concern, but with confirmation. He lowered the device and looked back at the dogs, his gaze lingering on the collar around the stronger one's neck. "These are not strays," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, carrying a weight that felt personal rather than procedural. Evelyn followed his gaze, her mind returning to the worn tag resting on the table, and something within her shifted, a quiet alignment of details that had not yet formed a full picture but were beginning to move toward one. "I thought as much," she said, her tone thoughtful, not surprised. Caleb nodded once, his hand resting loosely at his side, though there was a tension beneath the stillness, something waiting to be spoken but held back for the right moment. The stronger dog remained where he was, though his posture had changed again, less rigid now, more watchful than guarded, as if he had recognized not just Caleb, but what came with him. The smaller dog stirred faintly beneath the blanket, his breathing steady but fragile, and for a moment, all three of them stood in that quiet space, connected by something none of them had yet fully named. Caleb finally looked up at Evelyn, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that carried both clarity and restraint. "There is more to this," he said, not as a warning, but as a truth, and the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored. Evelyn did not look away. She simply nodded, her gaze calm, her voice soft but certain. "Then you had better tell me," she said, and outside, somewhere beyond the trees, the faint echo of another vehicle approached, distant but growing, as if the morning itself was beginning to gather around the story that had quietly found its way to her. Door. The sound of the second vehicle did not rush in. It approached with the same measured patience as everything else that morning, tires pressing softly against gravel, slowing long before reaching the edge of the property, as if whatever force guided it understood that urgency was not what this moment required. Caleb turned his head slightly toward the window, his posture tightening just enough to acknowledge the shift, but he did not move away from where he stood. "They are here," he said quietly, not with alarm, but with a kind of acceptance that suggested this had been expected long before he arrived. Evelyn remained still beside him, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, though something deeper within her had begun to stir, something that felt less like fear and more like the slow unfolding of a truth she had not yet been told. The stronger dog reacted first, his ears lifting, his body aligning toward the door once again. But this time there was no tension in the movement, only awareness, as if he recognized the pattern of what was coming and had already decided how to meet it. Outside, doors opened. More than one, footsteps followed, controlled and deliberate, not hurried, not chaotic, and then voices, low, coordinated, carrying just enough distance to remain indistinct, but close enough to confirm that this was no longer a single man's visit. Evelyn moved toward the window once more, her steps quiet, and parted the curtain just enough to see, and what she found there caused her breath to pause, not from fear, but from the weight of what it meant. 2 additional vehicles had arrived, positioned with quiet precision along the edge of her property, and several figures stood near them, dressed in dark uniforms that caught the morning light in sharp lines, their posture alert, their movements synchronized, not aggressive, but unmistakably purposeful. They were not rushing the house. They were surrounding it, gently, deliberately, like a boundary drawn not to trap, but to contain something important. "They are not here for you," Caleb said, his voice calm behind her, as if sensing the question before it formed, and Evelyn glanced back at him, her expression unreadable but steady. "Then they are here for them," she replied, and though it was not phrased as a question, it carried one beneath it. Caleb did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the table, his eyes falling upon the small metal tag that lay there, catching the light in a way that made its worn surface seem more significant than before. He picked it up carefully, turning it between his fingers, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around that single object. "You found this," he said, and Evelyn nodded once. "It was on one of them," she answered, her voice quiet but certain. Caleb exhaled slowly, his thumb brushing over the scratched surface, tracing the edges where the name had been worn away. "This is a K9 identification tag," he said at last, his tone measured, but there was something beneath it now, something that carried both recognition and concern. "They belong to a specialized unit." Evelyn watched him closely, her mind already moving ahead of his words, connecting what little she knew with what she was beginning to understand. "And their handler?" she asked softly. Caleb's gaze lifted from the tag, meeting hers with a steadiness that did not hide the truth, but did not rush it either. "He has been missing," he said, and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that seemed to echo against the walls. Behind them, the smaller dog stirred again, a faint movement that drew both their attention, and as Evelyn turned, she saw it. The smallest change, the smallest return, his eyes opening just slightly, unfocused but present, as if the world had begun to reach him again. The stronger dog moved immediately, stepping closer, lowering his head beside him, not nudging, not pushing, simply being there, as if that alone was enough to hold him in place. Evelyn felt something shift within her chest, something fragile but undeniable, and she stepped closer, kneeling once more beside them, her hand resting gently against the blanket. "You stayed," she whispered, not to either of them in particular, but to the moment itself, to the quiet loyalty that had carried them through the night and into whatever this morning was becoming. Outside, one of the officers approached the porch, his steps careful, stopping just short of the door, waiting, not forcing entry, and Caleb turned slightly toward the sound before looking back at Evelyn. "We are going to need to bring them in," he said, his voice calm, respectful, but firm in a way that left little room for refusal, and yet he did not move, not until she responded. Evelyn looked down at the 2 dogs, at the thin line between what they had been and what they might still become, and then back at Caleb, her eyes steady, her voice soft but unwavering. "Then you will do it here," she said, "because they are not leaving this house until they are ready." And for a moment, the world outside held its breath, as if waiting to see whether authority or something quieter, something deeper, would decide what happened next. Caleb did not answer her right away, not because he disagreed, but because something in her voice had shifted the ground beneath the moment, turning a procedure into something personal, something that required more than authority to resolve. He glanced toward the doorway where one of the officers waited just outside, then back at Evelyn, and gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough. "No one comes in without my say," he called out, his voice steady, carrying just enough weight to hold the line without raising it. And the officer on the porch responded with a brief acknowledgement before stepping back, leaving the threshold clear once more. The house seemed to settle after that, not quieter, but more contained, as if the outside world had agreed, at least for now, to remain at a distance. Evelyn turned her attention back to the dogs, her movements slow, deliberate, and knelt beside them again, her hand resting lightly against the blanket as though grounding herself in something real. The smaller dog's eyes were still open, just slightly, unfocused but present, and when she shifted closer, his gaze moved, faintly, but enough to find her. It was not recognition, not yet, but it was connection, a thin line stretched between what had been lost and what might still return. "You are still here," she whispered, her voice soft, almost reverent, and beside him, the stronger dog lowered his head just enough to rest near the smaller one's shoulder, his breathing steady, his presence unwavering. Caleb stepped closer then, careful not to disrupt the fragile space that had formed, and crouched a short distance away, his eyes moving between the two dogs with a focus that was both professional and deeply personal. "They were trained to work together," he said quietly, not as an explanation, but as a recognition of what he was seeing, and Evelyn nodded without looking at him, because she had already felt it in the way one had refused to leave the other, even when the cold had nearly taken them both. Caleb reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a small, folded photograph, worn at the edges, and hesitated for just a moment before placing it gently on the table beside the metal tag. Evelyn glanced at it, then picked it up slowly, her fingers careful, as if the image itself might carry weight. It showed a man, younger, standing beside two dogs that looked unmistakably like the ones before her now, stronger than, alert, proud, their coats clean, their posture steady, their eyes bright with purpose. The man's hand rested lightly against one of their shoulders, not restraining, not commanding, but connected, and there was something in his expression, something quiet and grounded, that made Evelyn's chest tighten before she even knew why. "Daniel Reeves," Caleb said softly, his voice lowering in a way that carried respect rather than formality. "Their handler." Evelyn's breath caught, not sharply, not with shock, but with the slow, heavy recognition of a name that did not belong to a stranger anymore. She looked back down at the dogs, at the worn collar, at the tag with its scratched letters, and then again at the photograph, her fingers trembling just slightly as she traced the edge of it. "He trusted them," she said, more to herself than to Caleb, and Caleb nodded once. "And they trusted him," he replied, his gaze steady, though something in it had softened, something that suggested this was no longer just a report to be completed. Evelyn set the photograph down slowly, her eyes returning to the smaller dog, whose breathing had grown steadier, whose presence felt less like something fading and more like something returning, piece by piece. Outside, the faint murmur of voices continued, controlled, patient, but present, a reminder that time was still moving forward, that decisions would need to be made. But inside, in that small, warm space, something else was happening, something quieter, something that did not follow the same rules. The stronger dog lifted his head slightly, his gaze shifting toward the table where the photograph lay, and for a moment, he held there, unmoving, as if he recognized it, not as an image, but as a memory. Then, slowly, he turned back to the smaller dog and lowered himself closer, his body forming a barrier that was not meant to keep others out, but to keep something fragile in. Evelyn watched him, her heart steady but full, and reached out, her hand resting gently against his fur for the first time without hesitation. He did not pull away. He did not flinch. He simply remained, as if accepting that this place, this moment, was no longer temporary. Caleb rose quietly, stepping back just enough to give them space, his eyes lingering on the scene before him, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to see it not as an officer, but as something else, something that could not be written in a report. "If he is out there," Evelyn said softly, her voice steady now, "they will wait for him." Caleb looked at her, then at the dogs, and though he did not answer immediately, the silence between them carried the truth clearly enough. Because sometimes, the ones who wait do not need to be told what they are waiting for, they already know, and they do not leave, not until the story finds its way back to them. The room held its quiet as if it understood that whatever came next would not arrive with noise, but with something softer, something that moved beneath words, and Evelyn remained where she was, her hand resting gently against the stronger dog's fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, grounded, present, unshaken by the movement outside. The smaller dog shifted again, more than before this time, his body, responding in slow, deliberate ways that spoke not of struggle but of return, and when his eyes opened a little wider, They did not drift aimlessly. They settled, briefly, on the shape beside him, on the presence that had never left. Caleb watched it unfold without interrupting, his posture still, his voice held back, because there were moments that did not belong to explanation, only to witness. Outside, the officers remained in place, their quiet coordination unchanged. But something in their stillness had shifted as well, as if the urgency that had brought them here had given way to patience, to the understanding that whatever they had come for was not something that could be rushed or taken by force. Time moved differently inside that house, measured not in seconds but in breaths, in the small, almost invisible changes that marked the distance between survival and something more. Evelyn leaned slightly closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are safe here," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of everything she had lost and everything she had found again in this unexpected moment. The stronger dog lifted his head just enough to look at her, his eyes steady, no longer guarded in the same way, but not fully at rest either, as if part of him remained anchored somewhere beyond the walls of that house, somewhere he had not yet returned from. Caleb stepped forward slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile balance, and knelt near the table, his gaze moving once more to the photograph. He picked it up again, studying it in silence, then looked back toward the dogs, and for a moment, something in his expression shifted, something that did not belong to duty. "They have not given up on him," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else, and Evelyn followed his gaze, her own thoughts aligning with his without needing to be spoken. "Then maybe he has not given up either," she replied, her voice calm, steady, holding a belief that did not ask for proof. The words settled into the room like warmth, subtle but real, and for a moment, even Caleb did not challenge them, because he had seen enough to know that sometimes the line between what was lost and what remained was not as clear as it seemed. The smaller dog drew in a deeper breath then, the kind that filled his chest more fully than before, and his body responded, not with strength yet, but with intention, a quiet insistence on staying, and beside him, the stronger dog shifted closer, his presence unwavering, his watch no longer tense but patient. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, not in exhaustion, but in something closer to gratitude, though she did not name it that, because it did not need a name. When she opened them again, the light in the room had changed, fuller now, warmer, stretching across the floor and catching the edges of the table, the photograph, the small metal tag that had started all of this, and she reached for it once more, turning it gently between her fingers. The scratched letters still did not fully reveal themselves, but they no longer needed to, because the story they carried had already begun to unfold in other ways. Caleb rose slowly, stepping back toward the door, his presence steady, his voice returning to that measured tone that carried both respect and responsibility. "We will stay nearby," he said, not as an order, but as an offering, and Evelyn nodded without looking up, her attention still on the dogs, on the fragile, growing life in front of her. The stronger dog glanced toward Caleb as he moved, his eyes following him for a brief moment, then returning to Evelyn, as if acknowledging both, as if understanding that not all departures meant abandonment. Outside, the officers adjusted their positions, not leaving, not advancing, simply remaining, a quiet perimeter around something they could not yet touch. And inside, the house held its warmth, its stillness, its quiet miracle, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable in the way it filled the space between breath and memory. Evelyn leaned back slightly, her hand still resting against the dog beside her, and for the first time in years, the silence around her did not feel like something to endure, but something to share, something alive, something that, like the two souls she had carried in from the cold, had found its way back when it was no longer expected. And in that gentle, unspoken understanding, the story did not end in certainty or answers, but in something quieter, something that lingered, like warmth after the fire has burned low, a reminder that sometimes, what is meant to return does not arrive all at once. It comes in small, steady breaths, and if you are willing to wait, it finds you.